Lander had frequently been at that courthouse to offer help to immigrants, to observe the proceedings, to make sure due process was being followed. The immigration courts are dismissing the cases of the immigrants who are showing up for due process. Then the Trump Gestapo, the ICE officers, they wait in the bushes or they wait outside. This was from June 5th, 2025, where Brad Lander explained, I'm going to show you this clip where he was beginning to do these observations. As you heard there, Brad Lander was saying, I'm not obstructing at all.
Imagine you're watching an immigration hearing, trying to help vulnerable families, and suddenly you're surrounded by ICE agents and under arrest. That's exactly what happened to New York City Comptroller Brad Lander. We'll walk you through the wild series of events, what Lander said that sparked the tension, and why he refused to back down. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now back to the video. Picture it, a courthouse packed with immigrants, advocates, and attorneys hustling back and forth through dingy hallways. But just as the usual tension of an immigration proceeding settles into the room, something absolutely bizarre unfolds. New York City Comptroller Brad Lander, a guy more familiar with spreadsheets and budgets than altercations with federal agents, finds himself surrounded by armed ICE officers. The scene looks straight out of a poorly scripted crime drama. People are shouting, cameras are shoving their way into the chaos, and Lander, visibly baffled, is demanding answers. The question on everyone's mind: what on earth is going on? The chaos all centered on the Manhattan Immigration Courthouse, a building normally buzzing with quiet anxiety but never fully descending into complete disorder until this day.
Donald Trump's goons at ICE just did it again. They physically attacked, accosted, and arrested a prominent Democratic politician, this time in New York City. They attacked and arrested the New York City comptroller named Brad Lander. Brad Lander's wife just posted the following message. Hi, this is Meg Barnett, Brad's wife. While escorting a defendant out of immigration court at 26 Federal Plaza, Brad was taken by masked agents.
Do you have a judicial warrant? Do you have a judicial warrant? Can I see the judicial warrant? Can I see the warrant? I will let go when you show me the judicial warrant.
In one corner, lawyers were hurriedly pulling out notepads. Immigrant families, clutching their documents, looked on in shock. And then there was Brad Lander, the city's comptroller, peppering the officers with basic questions. Why are you detaining me? Where's your judicial warrant? His tone was sharp but calm, his stance unshaken despite being flanked by ICE agents who refused to answer a single word. It had a strange sort of choreography to it, like everyone had rehearsed their lines except Lander, who clearly wasn't playing along. If you ask me, the whole thing looked more like an overzealous movie raid than what most people would imagine a legal arrest to look like. It had that jarring mix, suits clashing with uniforms, briefcases in the same shot as bulletproof vests. Think Law and Order, but with all the dignity swapped out for sheer confusion and a sprinkle of amateur dramatics. The ICE agents, decked out and looking like they were about to storm a hideout, instead latched onto a city bureaucrat who was essentially there to talk about human rights.
I just left immigration court proceedings at 290 Broadway, where families were coming in for hearings and ICE is making them subject to what's called expedited removal. These are families who have been here for more than a year, who have applied for asylum, and they have a right to have their case heard. But what Donald Trump and ICE are doing now is stripping that right away from them. It's terrifying for the city of New York. It's terrifying for the rule of law. So I thought it was important to show up and see for myself.
And no, Lander wasn't just some guy who wandered into the wrong room at the wrong time. He was there to do exactly what he's been doing for years, standing up for New York's immigrant communities. On this particular day, that meant being present as a vocal witness, helping ensure that undocumented immigrants received a fair process without being harassed or railroaded before they could leave the courtroom. One of his biggest concerns? ICE has a reputation for treating courthouses as traps, waiting at the exits like a bouncer with a vendetta. As outrageous as all of that sounds, Lander made it a point to show up anyway. Here's the kicker. We're talking about a guy who's legally untouchable in this regard. He's a US citizen, a longtime public servant, and someone who wasn't breaking any rules by being there. That's what made his arrest feel not only absurd, but also deeply chilling. Imagine walking into what's supposed to be a place of justice, only to get handcuffed and dragged out simply because you dared to ask why ICE agents were ignoring due process. That's less like law enforcement and more like a badly executed power trip. But the fallout didn't stop there. Lander's wife, Meg Barnett, wasn't about to keep quiet. As soon as word of the arrest spread, she showed up outside the courthouse, armed with that mix of indignation and composure you'd expect from someone who knows how unfair the system can be. This isn't just an abuse of Brad's rights. This is an abuse of everyone's rights, she told reporters, pointing out just how flimsy ICE's justification for the arrest seemed. By the time she finished, her message was clear. This wasn't just bad optics. This was outright authoritarian behavior. The most bizarre detail? The location itself. This all went down inside a courthouse. Literally the last place you'd expect such chaos unless maybe you've spent too much time watching legal dramas. The whole spectacle reeked of intimidation, sending a not so subtle message to anyone thinking about standing up to abusive policies. It's not hard to imagine how unnerving this must have been for the immigrants who were there hoping for a fair hearing. If it can happen to a public official with a platform, what's stopping it from happening to the people who don't have that power? So why was Brad Lander even in that courthouse on that particular day? What sequence of events led to this truly baffling and, let's be honest, embarrassing display of ICE theater? There's a story behind it, one that stretches far beyond this single moment of chaos. To understand why ICE agents acted like Lander was some kind of public enemy, we have to dig deeper into his history of work in immigration advocacy. Because believe me, this wasn't just about one man saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. This was bigger, much bigger than Brad Lander himself. What kind of person willingly steps into the tense, gray walls of an immigration courthouse, a place most would avoid at all costs? For Brad Lander, this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. The New York City Comptroller wasn't there for some staid government photo op, or because he stumbled into the wrong building. No, he was there because over the years, he's made it his mission to shine a light on some of the most brutal tactics ICE employs. Tactics that thrive on scaring people into submission and staying out of the public eye. Lander's no stranger to the immigration court system. He's spent countless days observing proceedings, showing up not as a politician looking for kudos, but as an advocate genuinely trying to support immigrant communities. His goal, simple enough, ensure that people receive due process. You know, that little thing we like to call a basic right. But what Lander's seen in those courts hasn't resembled fairness or justice. It's been cruelty, plain and simple. Unfathomably cruel is exactly how he described the way agents operate, and once you hear what he witnessed, you'll see why. Here's one snapshot of the so-called justice happening in those buildings. Imagine showing up for a court hearing that clears you. Your case is dismissed, no charges, you're free to go. Sounds like a relief, right? But not so fast. Lander watched as ICE agents literally waited in the shadows of the courthouse, ready to arrest these same people the moment they stepped outside. These weren't folks skipping laws or evading hearings. People were showing up, complying, and still being targeted. That's what made it feel like a game rigged from the start. The cruelty wasn't just reserved for adults trying to piece together a legal fight. Lander himself flagged a story that should send chills down anyone's spine. Take Dylan Contreras, a high school student right here in New York City. This kid was tricked, yes, tricked into expedited removal, effectively cutting short any chance he had to remain in the country legally. And if that's what ICE is willing to pull on teenagers, can you imagine the fear that ripples through communities? Parents afraid to take their kids to school, neighbors avoiding even the smallest interactions, all because no one knows when or where ICE might strike next. Lander isn't the type to sit on the sidelines after witnessing something like that. He decided to take action in the most straightforward way possible, by showing up. Walking families out of court after their hearings became part of his routine. Why? Not because he could magically shield them from ICE, but because his presence sent a message. Someone sees this, someone cares, someone isn't going to let this happen in silence. I thought it was important to bear witness, to show up, to do what I can to help these families see that New Yorkers, we value due process, he explained. It wasn't flashy or loud, it was simply about standing up for people who needed help. But here's the thing, when you're someone like Brad Lander and you start poking around in spaces the system doesn't want you in, people notice, and not in a good way. ICE agents aren't exactly fans of public scrutiny. Lander's presence wasn't just inconvenient for them, it was a direct challenge to their playbook. The unspoken rule of intimidation depends on keeping people too scared to speak up or push back. Having a city official observing, taking notes, and asking questions, that throws a wrench in the whole operation. And let's not overlook how deliberate all of this feels. His arrest wasn't fueled by some clear-cut legal violation. He wasn't obstructing things, wasn't hurting anyone, wasn't physically stopping ICE from doing their job. The footage says it all. Lander calmly asked to see a warrant. That's not a crime, that's common sense. But instead of answers, he got cuffed. Because this wasn't about enforcing immigration laws, it was about making an example out of him, a clear reminder to other advocates, this is what happens when you speak up. The irony is almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The guy was in the courthouse, arguably the most law-abiding place he could be, and ICE still acted like he was some kind of criminal mastermind. What does that say about how they view dissent? It doesn't come across as law enforcement anymore. It feels like a power grab aimed at silencing voices like Lander's. His arrest wasn't a coincidence. It was part warning and part smokescreen, a warning to others who might dare to do what he's doing, to call out the overreach, to question authority, to remind people that even immigrants have rights, and a smokescreen to distract from what was really happening that day, a courthouse being turned into a stage for ICE's scare tactics. But there's a bigger question here, one that makes the whole thing even more unsettling. If ICE is this bold when they know cameras are everywhere and the public eye is on them, what's happening in all the places no one's watching? Does this kind of thing only happen to someone like Lander because he challenges the system, or is it just the tip of the iceberg? You don't need to look far to find people lining up to say exactly how terrifying this has become. Zoran Madan Mamani called these kinds of actions fascism, a word that gets tossed around a lot but hits uncomfortably close to home in this case. Meanwhile, Greg Kassar called Lander's arrest outrageous, echoing the idea that this was far less about enforcing immigration laws than it was about sending a message. And let's not sugarcoat that message. Dissent will get you punished. Speak up, ask questions, or challenge authority, and suddenly you're the one the system turns on. But what's critical to understand here is that the point isn't just to intimidate people like Brad Lander or Alex Padilla. Those cases make headlines, sure, but the real goal is much deeper. Targeting high-profile individuals creates a ripple effect designed to scare ordinary people into silence. Immigrants, for example, already live with the constant fear of overreach, but actions like this serve notice to anyone who might stand up to help them too. Lawyers, advocates, even family members. They're all left wondering if lending a hand might just put a target on their own backs. And let's not pretend this intimidation is subtle. Take the research behind arrests like these, which shows a consistent push to conflate advocacy with obstruction. When officials make dissenters look like troublemakers, it creates a toxic environment where defending immigrant rights can be painted as anti-law enforcement. The act of showing compassion, or even asking a few questions, becomes radical. That shift doesn't just scare people into silence, it reshapes how the public sees dissent altogether. The numbers back this up too. Senator Padilla, referencing government data, pointed out something jaw-dropping. The majority of immigrants in ICE custody didn't even have prior criminal convictions. This isn't about tracking down hardened criminals, it's about flexing power over vulnerable people. And once you see that pattern, it's impossible not to connect the dots. If the system isn't going after genuine threats, then what exactly is all this enforcement really about? These tactics also feed into the chilling idea of creating an audience. Arresting someone like Brad Lander and Senator Padilla isn't just to stop them in their tracks, it sends a signal to anyone watching. It's theater, designed to shake up anyone sitting on the sidelines thinking about speaking out. Couple that with what Padilla called out about hidden abuses in places with zero oversight, and the picture gets much bleaker. It raises the question, how do you hold a system accountable when it relies on poor visibility to operate? And it's not just politicians or high-profile activists who see the warning signs, it's your neighbors, your local community volunteers, and even the broader public, all quietly realizing that the rights we assume are guaranteed are far more precarious than we'd like to admit. What's happening isn't about keeping order, it's about shifting the balance of power. Immigrants might be the ones most directly impacted, but actions like these stretch their shadow over everyone. This isn't about enforcing laws anymore, not when the same officials will bend rules just to suppress opposition. What Lander experienced in that courthouse wasn't law enforcement adhering to a higher standard. It was about making sure he and anyone else thinking of poking the system would think twice before stepping out of line again. The point isn't justice, it's control. And if this doesn't set off alarm bells, it should. Because the most frightening part about all of this isn't just what we've seen happen on camera, it's what's playing out in the dark corners of the system, where no reporters are allowed, no phones are recording, and no one's watching. How far can this go when scrutiny vanishes completely? Brad Lander's arrest isn't just some bizarre courthouse drama, it's a reminder of what happens when those in power twist the rule of law into a blunt weapon. As Senator Padilla warned, if what you saw happen can happen when the cameras are on, imagine what is happening where there are no cameras. That's the real danger. Unchecked power thrives in darkness. To protect democracy, people need to stay sharp, hold leaders accountable, question authority, and push for transparency, because no one is immune when liberties start unraveling. Defending the vulnerable doesn't just protect them, it safeguards us all.